Welcome everybody to today's episode of the Great Birth Rebellion podcast, where we grapple with current research and historical knowledge to help you get the best out of your pregnancy, birth and postpartum journey. My name is Dr. Melanie Jackson at Melanie the Midwife. I'm a clinical and research midwife with my PhD, which is why I send out a weekly email which contains the resources that we use to create every single Great Birth Rebellion episode. You can join the podcast mailing list at melaniethemidwife.com. Our Great Birth Rebellion premium members also get access to podcast transcripts, additional resources, the Ask Mel a Question button, and an exclusive monthly Ask Me Anything episode where I answer listener questions. That said, let's get into it. Welcome to today's episode of the Great Birth Rebellion podcast. Mel with you here, and today I'm answering the question, do placentas really start failing after 40 weeks of pregnancy? We're talking about the myth of the failing placenta, and many authors have also spoken about this, and I'll be drawing on their work today as well as other evidence as always. Now, this topic stems from women being told by their care providers that if they don't get induced, the more pregnant they get and the longer they gestate, the more likely it is that their placenta will get old and stop functioning so well. Women are told that the placenta, the very thing keeping their baby alive and healthy, they're told that it'll just stop working or stop functioning properly. Many authors write about the aging placenta. So today's episode asks, does the placenta age and function more poorly in later pregnancy than in early pregnancy? And the answer to this question is important because a significant driver for induction of labour in well-healthy women, and something that's contributing to Australia's nearly 50% induction and augmentation rates, is that most hospitals will have a policy to induce labour once you're about 10 days past your 40-week due date. This is actually happening earlier and earlier than that, and many women are told that if they don't get induced that they will put their baby at risk because their placenta functions more poorly in the later stages of pregnancy. So we're going to address this today, and this episode is an extension of episode 3, which is called Due Dates, and we allude to the idea that placentas start failing in that episode, but we didn't really discuss it. So I'm doing that today. And I'll start with a rehash of something I spoke about all the way back in episode 3. So the first bit of this podcast today is actually a throwback to that episode and what I said. Firstly, about the issues with estimating a due date anyway, and the inaccuracies wrapped up with that. And then we'll go into discussion about what happens to your placenta after 40 weeks and some of the possible impacts of being pregnant past 41 weeks, with the intention of giving you information that might help you make decisions about your options later in pregnancy. I will say that there is a difference between a healthy placenta and circumstances where you may have been formally diagnosed with something called placental insufficiency, where it's actually determined by careful assessment and ultrasound that your baby's placenta is indeed not functioning as it should. And this can occur under many circumstances, and it requires monitoring and possible intervention if it's impacting on your baby. So I just want to differentiate here that we're talking about a different thing to placental insufficiency. So I'll first start with some snippets from episode 3 and pick up after that. Let's do it. Before we go all the way to how to calculate a due date, I wanted to talk about what a full-term normal pregnancy is. So when they give you an estimated date of birth, so firstly estimated, and then it's actually the 40th week of your pregnancy is what they're estimating. Like you are 40 weeks pregnant. But a normal term pregnancy is any time from 37 weeks to 42 weeks. And obviously there's outliers, like a 36-week pregnancy could well and truly produce a beautifully normal birth, and as could a 43-week pregnancy, a lot more unusual, but could also be fine. In Australia, the Women's and Babies report came out, which gives us all the general stats on inductions and cesareans and all that kind of stuff. And if you are a first-time mother here in Australia, the induction rate for first-time mothers is 46.8%. So almost 1 in 2 first-time mothers will have their pregnancies induced for one reason or another. I refuse to believe that half of the women actually have indications for that. And I'm coming at this, I've had 4 clients this year who've gone beyond 42 weeks. And I don't have a massive client load when you think about compared to the hospital. Like I see 30 to 40 clients a year. So I've done a lot of delving into like the post beyond 42 research. So why the rush? So what I have learned is that the number one cause of going beyond 42 weeks is a miscalculation of estimated due date. That's in the research. That's literature. They're like, actually, the number one cause is poorly estimated due dates. And I'll tell you how it all started, this due date saga. This story, ladies and gentlemen, starts with a German obstetrician. What's his name? Franz Nagel. Okay, so German obstetrician. He died in 1851. So you can imagine maybe the 1800s. Maybe it was in the middle of his life when he came up with what's now still called Nagel's rule from an obstetrician, not from so this is completely medical idea of pregnancy. We're not talking about like, the traditional midwives and, these really wise civilizations who were watching pregnancy way before the 1800s and working out when a baby comes out. Observation. This is from a medical philosophy. All of this intuitive and historical knowledge that people gathered by watching and observing has been completely overshadowed by the medical way we do things now. So even the process of estimating a due date has been completely medicalized and taken over by obstetrics. So sweet Nagel, Nagel's rule relies on women knowing when the start of their last menstrual period was. So it's a maths game, really. So and all of those apps, when the due date calculators online, they're all basically based on Nagel's rule. So then you've got to apply Nagel's rule, you have to know when the start of your last period was. And then you add 7 days, subtract 3 months, and then like add the next year onto it. So you add 7 days, subtract 3 months, that's your due date. And it gives you a due date, which is in 10 months' time. So we're not pregnant for 9 months. People are like, oh, it's 9 months. It's actually 10 months. So another, what the heck? Yes, 10. It's 10. And people talk about it being 10 moons, actually. So we're not even talking about, 10 moons.
Yes.
And so that's the due date calculator. But that is based on a woman who bleeds regularly 28-day bleeding cycle. Mm-hmm. So if your menstrual bleed comes earlier than 28 days or your cycle's irregular or you have a 34-day cycle, you have to add or minus days from Nagel's rule. So if you've added 7 days because you have a 28-day bleeding cycle, if you have a 30-day bleeding cycle, you have to add 9 days. Or if you have a 26-day bleeding cycle, you have to add only 5 days. When when Nagel's rule tells you that you're 4 or 5 weeks, so you wee on a stick, if you apply Nagel's rule to your pregnancy, it'll tell you you're 4 or 5 weeks pregnant by the time you skip your bleed, your period. Boom, they say you're 4 or 5 weeks pregnant. You're actually not, because you ovulate approximately, this is again very wildly different for every woman, but approximately mid-part in your cycle, like day 14, approximately. Some women I know ovulate early and later. So Nagel's rule assumes that you've ovulated day 14, and that's when you conceive. But if you've got an irregular cycle and you don't really know when you ovulated or when your next period was supposed to come, Nagel's rule is wildly inaccurate. But Nagel's rule takes your pregnancy right back to the first day of your last bleed. So when they say you're actually 4 or 5 weeks pregnant, you're at best 2 or 3 weeks, like your baby is 2 or 3 weeks old. Even that is an issue in terms of calculating. So if I've got clients who know, they're like, I know I conceived on this particular day because they've been tracking their cycle, or they like, that's the only day we had sex that month. I couldn't have gotten pregnant any other day. Then you go, right, that's your conception time. And we add 38 weeks. So that's what I have to say about Nagel's rule. And that's what everything's calculated off. Also, the system doesn't trust women to know things. So now the guidelines are recommending every woman to have a dating scan. So, and if your dating scan has I think it's a week difference to your estimated due date, guess which one they use? They will trust the ultrasound more than a woman's recollection or more than Nagel's rule, if that's what women went off. So ultrasound has now become the authoritative technique for estimating due dates. There still can be out by 6 days. So that's the buffer. And so then fast forward, you're 41 weeks and 3 days, and they're saying we need to induce you. You've got to start thinking about how accurate is this estimated due date calculating. It's not 1 or 2 days accurate. It could be a whole week out. And even I do it myself when, women are approaching their 42-week gestation. I'm like, okay, let's go right back to the beginning and let's talk through your conception journey. And some women were like, oh gosh, I was so vagued out. I wasn't calculating. It was a complete surprise. Like I had the dating scan, but that was different to when I thought I had gotten pregnant. And so, you start to get a picture and go, okay, we could be talking a difference of a week here. If your estimated date of birth correlates well, like if you apply Nagel's rule, you kind of have a vague idea of roughly when you might have gotten pregnant, and you have an ultrasound and they all seem to line up. I think that's a pretty good indicator that you're in the ballpark. But where, there's a week difference between your estimated due date by Nagel's rule and when you thought you conceived and the ultrasound, we're just kind of stabbing in the dark as to like when you actually got pregnant. So I guess the other reasons for going beyond 42 weeks, it could be a familial genetic thing where, when women talk about, oh yeah, all my sisters, my mum went overdue, that's our family story. And some babies need to gestate for 42 weeks to be ready. And some babies are ready at 39. So there's a complex web of things that happen to trigger off labor. And thank God we actually don't really know all the pieces that are required, that happen in the body and how a woman and the baby's body interact to trigger off labor. Because if we did know, then that just opens the door to manipulate birthdays even more than we already do. So there's the estimating your due date. Then there's the fact that not all babies need to gestate over 40 weeks to be born, but honestly, most do. Anytime a woman gives birth before 40 weeks, in my particular client load, I get a bit of a surprise. I'm like, oh, wasn't expecting that. And we could talk about the ARRIVE trial, which actually the big outcome from the ARRIVE trial is they said if you induce everyone at 39 weeks, which seems to be what they believe is this golden point in a pregnancy where you don't have the issues of prematurity. Like if you induce a woman at 37 weeks, in your mind as a practitioner, you're thinking, okay, we've reduced the risk of one thing by getting the baby out of this woman who's a danger to her child. This is the medical way of thinking. We've reduced that risk of the pregnancy, but we've increased the risk for the baby because there's elements of prematurity where the baby might not adapt to being born yet. So the issues of prematurity get less and less the further you go along in the pregnancy. And they believe by 39 weeks, if you induced everybody, you would have a very small risk of prematurity complications for the baby. So then once women are 39 weeks, then they believe that you've reduced the risk of prematurity. But what does start to go up, it goes up from about 37 weeks, is the rates of stillbirth. And this is the fear in every single practitioner's mind. This is what makes them act, is the risk of stillbirth. So anytime they talk to women about induction for post-dates, I'm using speech marks again, post-dates, I hate that term, they will always quote the research that the stillbirth rate doubles, right? Once you go over 41 weeks, the stillbirth rate doubles. Now, the research shows that the stillbirth rate does double, but that is misleading because at 41 weeks, your risk of stillbirth is 6 in 10,000 pregnancies. But if you had 10,000 women all pregnant with babies, not monkeys, all pregnant, in the 41st week, 6 of those babies would be lost to stillbirth. Like, this is just a general stat. And I know it's different in different ethnicities, and I know it's different depending on women's risk level. But if we look generalized at all the research, like if you bunch everybody in, 6 in 10,000. Now, by the time you get over 41 weeks and you're approaching 42 weeks, it's 10.8 in 10,000. And this is stillbirths, not during labor. This is like while you're pregnant. So super small numbers. Like, we're still talking in the 10,000s. We're not talking in the hundreds. We're not talking like 1 in 100 or anything like that. So beyond 41 weeks, it's 10.8 per 10,000. So yeah, theoretically, approximately doubles. But that's what they're frightened of. That is it. And so to induce that many women for being beyond 41 weeks doesn't seem like a fair swap to me in terms of the impact that induction can have on a woman's experience, the pressure it puts on the system, and the absolute disrespect for the importance of spontaneous labour seems to be a massive overreaction to this statistical risk of 10.8 in 10,000 stillbirths. And I guess here too, we can talk about, okay, what do you do if you're sure of your due dates, or even if you're not sure of your due dates, and you find yourself in a situation where you're being told that you need to be induced or that they want to book an induction, because that's another thing you can do. If you want to, go ahead, book an induction date like the hospital will say, but you are free to just not show up to that appointment if you don't feel like having your baby at that time, if you feel like that's not the time. But there's a lot we can do now with technology if you want to find out how well your baby is. A client of mine ends up 42 weeks. I'll always offer them the opportunity. What do you want to do now? And they say, well, what can I do? So I have a little, I get to run this spiel a little bit because obviously, it actually happens quite a lot that I'm talking to women about, what do you want to do if you go beyond 42 weeks? Ultrasounds are not a bad way of working out placental function, because that's the other thing that people say is that, you hit your due date and then your placenta just carks it and stops working, which is not really what happens to placentas.
Okay, so that was a recap from our due dates episode 3. And now we're going to pick up from here and ask, what happens to your placenta after 41 or 42 weeks? And firstly, can I just invite you to sign up to our mailing list and get access to the resources on this episode, because they are, wow, what the heck, out of this world, eye-opening. I knew some of this stuff before I started researching for this episode, but man, did I get blown away by what is known about this topic. So sign up for the mailing list. You can do that in the show notes, and have a read of some of the resources and information that I've put in the resource folder for this episode. Okay, so first I'm going to say that broadly speaking, the placenta does definitely go through changes and adaptations through pregnancy, and this is no different in the later stages of pregnancy. The placenta is a transient and temporary organ. It's a fetal organ, so it's your baby's DNA, your baby makes it. And scientists have done research to discover how and if the placenta changes in later pregnancy, in the 41st and 42nd week. In fact, there was some research done, some of the papers referred to research done in the 60s and 70s, and a few of the placentas were 46 weeks old. We don't let pregnancies go that long these days. And the research has been pretty conclusive, and there isn't much argument that yes, the placenta changes. However, there is disagreement about if these changes are just normal changes that the placenta undergoes as it gets more mature, or are these pathological changes that will actually cause harm to babies. Because there is an increase in stillbirth in later pregnancy gestations, some scientists and researchers make the immediate leap to assuming that because the placenta changes in late pregnancy, that more babies are stillborn in later pregnancy. They assume there must be a direct causal link. However, in a most recent paper called Morphological and Functional Changes in Placentas from Prolonged Pregnancies, and there's a full text version of that in the resource folder, it was published in 2021, and it's one of the more recent papers that I'll be discussing today. So this paper states that, and this is a quote, "The link between prolonged pregnancy and stillbirth and neonatal death has led to the hypothesis that the placenta ages." The word here is hypothesis. This is still a theory. No one has yet to be able to agree and make a definite and direct connection between placental changes and stillbirth in later gestations. It certainly couldn't always be pathological changes. Otherwise, all babies beyond 41-42 weeks would be unwell or not survive. When in fact, this paper itself states the stillbirth rate for babies born at 42 weeks is 0.32%. They state that of 1,000 babies born at 42 weeks, 3.1 will very sadly be stillborn. So if this is the case that placentas change in later pregnancy, and they do, can we assume that these changes are pathological if 99.68% of babies born around 42 weeks are not stillborn? The authors of this 2022 paper also state that the changes that happen in the placenta in later term pregnancies is normally an adaptive process and an adaptive response to being a longer pregnancy. But they assume that this reaches a critical point in prolonged pregnancies, which then leads to a reduction in placental function. However, the argument that the placenta ages and suffers is not universally accepted. In 1997, and I realize this is a later study, but stay with me. In 1997, an author by the name of Fox argued that a review of the available evidence indicates that the placenta does not undergo a true aging change during pregnancy. There is, in fact, no logical reason for believing that the placenta, which is a fetal organ, should age while the other fetal organs do not. The situation in which an individual organ ages within an organism that is not aged is one which does not occur in any biological system. Fox says that the persisting belief in the placental aging has been based on confusion between morphological maturation and differentiating that from age. So Fox is suggesting, is the placenta just mature and showing changes based on maturity, or is it aging and a reduction in function? So again, while this paper is dated, it was published in 1997, it seems that there's still an intention by researchers to prove the causality, so the cause between placental aging and an increase in stillbirth. But for now, and what we know from this more recent 2022 paper, is that this causal link still remains a theory. So while there are cellular and structural changes in the placenta at full term and beyond, there hasn't really been research that shows that these changes equal a change in function. So yes, there is a change in structure and activity. Some people want to call this aging, but the question is, does this lead to a change in function? And also, does the placenta need to change structure and function in later pregnancy as an adaptive mechanism? So these are the questions that haven't been answered yet. But I do want to highlight that the vast majority, over 99% of babies born after 42 weeks will not be stillborn. And so can we assume that these placental changes might not be pathological based on the success rate of births at that gestation? So this 2020 paper concludes, it says, the findings summarized here demonstrate growing evidence of structural and biochemical features of aging at play in placentas from prolonged pregnancies. While the concept of placental aging underlying the adverse perinatal outcome has been previously questioned, there is now a substantial body of evidence demonstrating that the placenta demonstrates changes with advancing gestation. While these changes may initially be adaptive, allowing the placenta to mitigate the effects of increasing oxidative stress, these may become overwhelmed, meaning the placenta is less able to meet the needs of the baby in prolonged pregnancy. The findings reviewed here identified macroscopic observations of reduced placental growth, microscopic changes in the placental villus structure, and functional changes in oxygen and nutrient delivery in prolonged pregnancies. So what they're saying is that changes occur, yes, but I do want to remind you again of the survival rate of babies born around 42 weeks to be 99.68%. So are these changes adaptive and responsive to the needs of a baby at that gestation, or are they pathological? So this paper itself concludes by saying that evidence demonstrates that prolonged pregnancy is associated with fetal, neonatal, and maternal complications. Yes, that is true, that the rate of complications increases, and that this can be reduced by a policy of an induction of labour before 42 weeks gestation. However, the number of interventions needed to prevent one perinatal death is high. This is what the authors of this paper said. The number of interventions needed to prevent one perinatal death is high. Over 400 women need to be induced. So this paper is saying that you would need to unnecessarily induce over 400 well and healthy women and babies to prevent one poor outcome. The authors have concluded that improved understanding of the underlying pathophysiology of prolonged pregnancy potentially allows identification of prolonged pregnancies that are at highest risk of this adverse outcome, but it's presently challenging as signs of abnormal placental blood flow, placental calcification, or low amniotic fluid volumes are insufficiently predictive to be of any clinical use. They're basically saying we don't really know how to check which babies beyond 42 weeks are well and which ones are not that well. There are some identifying features, but they don't feel confident in that yet. So what they're saying is that they don't currently know how to adequately monitor pregnancies that go beyond 42 weeks yet. They can't predict which babies will be fine, and so currently the strategy is to induce everybody before they get to 42 weeks in order to avoid the really sad circumstance of a stillbirth for 0.38% of babies born after 42 weeks. And I say this with the deepest sympathy for any woman who's lost a baby. One baby lost is too many, and I wish this would never ever happen to any woman. I'm just offering this information to women and care providers who are navigating the challenge of deciding if they should induce a pregnancy based on the argument of the aging placenta. So if we can conclude by saying that there is evidence of cellular changes in the placenta throughout the course of pregnancy, there still isn't solid evidence to prove that this is indeed aging rather than adaptation, or that these changes truly account for the rise in stillbirth when pregnancies continue beyond 42 weeks. The concept of the aging placenta is still just a theory. If you're experiencing a pregnancy at or beyond 42 weeks, or if you have concerns for your baby at any time in your pregnancy, your usual maternity care provider is best placed for you to discuss with them what you would like to do next. There are some strategies for monitoring and closely watching women who are beyond 42 weeks. And this is usually done with ultrasound, most commonly to monitor for amniotic fluid volume and blood flow through the placenta as a way of monitoring placental function, and checking if the baby's and checking the baby's movements closely. And they can also do a biophysical profile on a baby. And this is the usual strategy, and I adopt that for my clients who gestate beyond 42 weeks. I inform them that yes, there is an increase in poor outcomes for babies after 42 weeks, albeit very small, and that most babies, over 99%, will be born well. but there are placental changes that occur through pregnancy and as the placenta matures. So for my clients, I offer them the opportunity of induction if they want it. Very few take that opportunity up. And so then I offer clients regular ultrasounds beyond 42 weeks, daily well-being checks, the potential of CTG, and the management of your 42-week pregnancy should be done alongside your care provider. So, to answer the question for today's podcast, do placentas fail as they get older? We truly don't know if they fail, but we do know that they change. But we don't know if it's these changes that lead to the increase in adverse outcomes for pregnancies beyond 42 weeks. But what we do know is that the vast majority, over 99% of babies born at 42 weeks will be well, and that we must induce over 400 well and healthy women and babies to prevent a single stillborn babe. So now it's up to you to decide if you want to be induced or if you want to watch and wait.
Thank you for being here for today's episode of the Great Birth Rebellion podcast. If you want to get access to all the resources that we use to create every single podcast episode, you can join the mailing list at melaniethemidwife.com, or better still, the Premium Members Hub. The Premium members get access to transcripts, the Ask Mel a Question button, an exclusive Ask Me Anything episode every month. All the details are in the show notes, and I will see you in the next episode of the Great Birth Rebellion.